When we decided to talk about this topic, I told myself it would be a walk in the park. There are so many things to say, it will just be a matter of choosing. In fact, there would be so many things to say that I am not at all sure I have constructed a coherent path, but we will try to touch on the most important topics, and above all, we will try to show how the things we can say about sexual life in the Middle Ages are linked to precise information that comes to us from that era. We are able to say something about this topic because medieval literature discusses it, but also because jurists, medieval canonists, and medieval physicians talk about it, and therefore there is a set of information coming from different directions that all converge to fundamentally tell us one thing. What I'm about to say may be a bit drastic, perhaps oversimplifying things, but it is important to counter a prejudice that I think is quite widespread. Medieval society is a society that is very little repressed. Only towards the end of the Middle Ages is there a noticeable increasing effort from the clergy, but especially from governments, to impose greater control, punish deviations, and force people to adhere to certain behavior models. Until that moment, there exists a freedom of behavior and language in medieval society that is not comparable at all to much more repressed periods such as the Renaissance, the modern age, and from a linguistic perspective, even our own. Indeed, I who wanted to do it will hesitate, I believe, to read to you, even in translation excerpts from certain medieval texts, because they use words that we no longer bring up in public. You tell me I'll put the asterisks, then if you want me to be more explicit in certain cases, yes. Then, I wanted to clarify that there are many sources, not just literature, because I will cite medieval literature a lot, and one might say, yes, that's fine, but who guarantees that literature truly reflects behaviors? Well, legal sources tell us the same things. Literature certainly speaks to us of an era in which sex is considered a fact of life that must be dealt with and discussed with a certain degree of freedom. And I want to emphasize this given the theme of our festival this year, which concerns both men and women equally. Let me share a Boccaccio novella. Self-discovery is an idea, a wall for those who falter in school. Peter of Vinciolo's novella, The Wolf, shows the distraught don't win. I think it's 100 or so, igniting like this. Even if I can't discover it with certainty, find what you are, I don't know, in short. It was in Perugia, King Usama, we are in the area, not much time has passed yet. It should cover a past incident, a wealthy man named Peter of Vinciolo. It is the last novella of the 5th day of the Decameron. Peter of Vinciolo, as Boccaccio says, had married, but not because he wanted to, but to put on a facade, to deny what everyone in Perugia said about him, which was very true, namely that he did not like women. It is a pity that he took as his wife a girl, says Boccaccio, with red hair. It is indeed ignited, which 2 husbands rather than one would have wanted. The redhead realizes very early on that Peter of Vinciolo is not interested in her, and that he leaves her alone in bed. When he realizes it, he gets angry. If I had not believed that he was a man, I would have never taken him. Reasoning to herself, she thought that at this point she was certainly justified in taking lovers. Of course, it is technically illegal, but the husband does much worse. I can also break the law by taking lovers, since he not only breaks the law but also nature. If I wanted to renounce the world, I would become a nun, but I don't want to give up anything. Make a friend. The redhead starts. Relationships, and you see the witnesses. Then, as you imagine, what always happens in these novellas. This is when you reveal, as always in these novellas, one evening when the husband is away, she brings a handsome young man, and the husband returns. These are the situations that are ideal for a storyteller. Solutions for a storyteller lend themselves to many different solutions in medieval literature, starting from this situation, the husband among. In this situation, in historical medieval literatures, the developments can be countless and varied and diverse. For example, in the Fablio, which are French comic and erotic poems from the 200s. Especially older than Boccaccio, the stories told are very similar to those found in the more risque novellas of the Decameron. In the Fablio, the story is often of this type. The lover who has come to visit the lady in her husband's absence is a priest. Priests are notoriously great suitors of their parishioners. Moreover, they are people who know how to speak, who have means, and therefore they are easily educated. So it can happen that, surprise, the time that my friend has indicated is the 3rd and 5th. The priest has brought some fine wines and a dish to share in the company of the unembarrassed. The priest is coming from speaker returning. He is surprised by the husband returning. The priest must hide, but he does not hide. The husband does not understand. The husband is a dyer, and in the workshop hours, there is a large vat. The wife pushes him. Hide there in hours. And then, at the right moment, the priest dives into the vat, which is full of red dye. The priest remains immersed in it. And after a while, the husband realizes that something is strange about his wife's behavior. In the end, he suspects what has happened. Glancing into the workshop, he realizes it. And at this point, the husband pretends not to notice. After they have eaten and drunk well, the husband says, "Now I need to go to the workshop for a moment. I have soaked a crucifix in dye. I want to see it, life-size. I want to see if it has colored well." Then he goes to uncover the tub. The priest has eaten the leaf. He is found like this, ready, motionless. The dyer calls the servants. They pull him out, examine him. He is well colored. Let's leave him standing there to dry. They leave him standing there to dry, but the story continues. He was there naked. It is hot. After a while, something starts to stir, and the dyer, still pretending not to notice, says, "But when has anyone ever seen?" And here is the point where I must use asterisks, because the French text says, "When has anyone ever seen a crucifix with the C dots dots and with the C dots dots?" The sculptor's board must be drunk. Marco, now let's see. Where's the saw? Thanks. Like what you can imagine. But a story of this kind can be found even earlier in a text not of Christian Western European origin. Therefore, this city is subject to hypocrisy, and the originating text is a valuable one. But it describes the behaviors of those strange people who are indeed the Christian Europeans. It is an extraordinary risk. It is a testorapo from the beginning of the 12th century. It is an extraordinary risk, the era of the Crusades. The author who used the network of an archive is the same. It is the same. An Arab prince who has fought the Crusaders his entire life. It is an extraordinary risk for all Christians. It is an extraordinary risk, or rather, he fought them in wartime, or during this wartime, in times of truce. The time for credit has already passed. He did business with them, visited them, discussed with them, got to know their world, and then in his memoirs, he tells his Islamic audience what strange people these Franks are, and I don't know. And in this way, this is a very difficult day. And this is a minor issue. Just look at how they behave with their wives. They don't know what jealousy is. "I am Professor Giuseppe," says Usama. For example, he is a pianist. He says, "You know that a man can very well go out on the street with his wife and then meet friend and start chatting. And if the conversation goes on for a while and the husband has things to do, he is a fool. A pianist went out to talk with his wife and he told me, suggest to a friend to become pleasant. Thank you. If you want to take the number you mentioned, I am at your service." He goes off to his business and leaves his wife in the middle of the street talking to another man. And what does Usama say to his audience? There is nothing to be done. He does not need to hear it said. And there is nothing to be done. Something inconceivable and unheard of. After that, Usama proceeds to add an additional burden. And I used another. He says, "If you do not know what can happen among these people who have no sense of honor, it happened once that there was a merchant." He speaks of him as if he had known him, a divine merchant, merry divine merchant. He says it happened once that there was a merchant. In one of these Crusader cities, obviously on the coast of the Holy Land, one day this merchant says, "And look at how these stereotypes are indeed. Here we are at the beginning of the 12th century, and the author is an Arab prince." One day the merchant returns home and finds his wife in bed with another man. The merchant confronts the intruder and says, "What are you doing in that bed?" And the intruder replies, "What do you want?" "I was very tired and I asked if I could rest a little." He said, "But excuse me, "Is this woman, that is your wife, sleeping there in bed with you?" And the other replies, "But the bed is his. I couldn't exactly stop her from using it too." At this point, Usama says, the merchant said, "and the king of the round, for which I will go to scold you, and I have resolved, if you do it again, we will quarrel." And this, says Usama, is all their jealousy and their subordinate sense for them. So, the story is very quick, as you can see. Indeed, starting from this point, many conclusions can be drawn. Conclusion of the novella of the mortgage. The conclusion of Boccaccio's novella is that it is a true mortgage. Peter of Vinciolo, we will win, arriving, and finding the wife in agitation, and the husband will be a friend. The poor idea caused hesitation, worried and hearing strange noises. However, as we hear the noises, it occurs to me that he finds the malvidenza. At this point, in the meantime, Peter of Vinciolo sees that his wife's lover is a young man who he was very interested in, someone he had been pursuing for a while, with whom he had never managed to achieve anything. And so he says to him, "No, calm down, I'm not going to do anything to you." He takes him by the hand, goes to his wife and says, "Hey, what is this story?" At this point, the wife tells him to his face that he has little to protest about, because since he, the husband, does not take care of her, she has every right to resolve things on her own. And understand wisely, Peter, that I am a woman like the others, and I have desires like the others. I too desire what all women desire. This novella is unique due to its protagonist. Instead of continuing the scene, Peter tells his wife, "Let's not argue. Have you had dinner?" Boccaccio notes justice is served as Peter resolves the situation. When asked if he found a dead man, he replied, "There's no greater satisfaction than throwing him out," as Boccaccio says. And with the festive air, it slipped my mind. Okay, the thread, as already mentioned, has been reconnected in the square. And this has not even been had. And it told me, and if it is not, I do not feel it. I say, so, it is certainly a novella, but from a novella like this, we can draw a series of conclusions that are generally inconsistent with the image of a particularly repressed era. Everyone in sex, with great freedom, with not only that, sex is seen as a diabolical thing, an evil thing. No, sex is part of nature. It is something that everyone needs, men and women. It is a part of life and a right. The fact that women also have this right is worth emphasizing, obviously, because another common belief about the Middle Ages is that it was a misogynistic era, and it is clear that it is a patriarchal and male-dominated society from many points of view, but being misogynistic would be something else. The marital duty is a legal obligation for both the husband and the wife, and the failure to fulfill this duty by the husband can also be a reason to request a separation. Finally, are deviations repressed? Peter da Vinciolo is a homosexual. Everyone knows how Boccaccio represents him. Boccaccio is not interested in depicting something completely unrealistic. He portrays a rich, respected man. And everyone knows he is homosexual, yet nothing happens to him at all. And this is a great lesson, because if we have time later, we will talk about it a little. Not that there are laws that theoretically suppress homosexuality, but we have a clear sense that until the end of the Middle Ages, these laws were not really enforced. One really has to get into trouble to end up caught in the nets of these prohibitions. Therefore, it is foolish to believe that just because a certain behavior is prohibited, it is not practiced in that society. It would be like believing that political corruption does not exist here because the law forbids it. Another recurring stereotype is the idea that, in any case, the clergy was misogynistic and sexophobic. Here the problem is that today, those who do not spend their entire lives eating Middle Ages for lunch and dinner may find it hard to distinguish between what a monk could have been, what a friar could have been, what a priest could have been, or perhaps a regularly married cleric. Keep in mind that Boccaccio was a priest, for example, and so there have always been monks in the clergy. If they were good monks, they stayed locked in their monasteries, practiced chastity, and if they had erotic dreams, they thought it was the devil sending them. But in the Middle Ages, for many centuries, the priests and clerics who were in contact with the people instead got married. Then there will come the moment in the 11th century when, in theory, it will be imposed on priests not to marry anymore. Clerics of the lower orders will continue to be able to marry freely even afterwards. Since the 11th century, priests have officially been prohibited from marrying. The clear impression is that these prohibitions concerned more the forms than the substance. It is only in the modern age, with the Counter-Reformation, that there will be a stronger effort to prevent the priest, the parish priest, from living with a woman. But in the centuries of the late Middle Ages, the feeling is that it is actually very common for a priest to cohabit. He simply can no longer call her my wife, and the children are no longer considered legitimate if they come. The bishop, if he wants to cause trouble, can use that pretext to give him a hard time, but people are very accustomed to the fact that the priest still has a partner. I say this simply to clarify that we should not imagine a church that is completely alien to matters of sex and hostile and repressive. Thank you. There is even the impression that people are so accustomed to the idea that a priest, despite any charming feelings he might have, and even a bishop, can easily have relationships and natural children, that this does not really affect their judgment of the person. A good bishop is distinguished by other qualities, not by those. A ministry is showing a Franciscan unity from the 200s. I think of a chronicler like Salimbeni of Parma, a Franciscan friar from the 200s. He proceeds to move around a society. He is an important friar, very cultured, that has immigration, a car, an identity, an institution, an allocation for time. There are social aspects. In one part, the scoundrels were those who were greedy, for me, who are not capable of hosting people properly. I don't know, because hospitals do what they should, keeping their rights, holding on to their wealth for themselves. For those I have an immigration. Other aspects, on the other hand, are secondary. One of the bishops that Salimbeni of Parma admires the most and describes as a completely positive character is Philip of Pistoia, the Archbishop of Ravenna. The most positive thing is that when he invites the Archbishop of Ravenna to lunch, there is good food and drink for everyone. Even those sitting at the back receive the best wines. Not like certain bishops who drink the good wine themselves and give their guests the inferior one, as Salimbene of Parma said, as if all the throats would not remain fetid to the spectre. But beyond this, Philip of Pistoia, the Archbishop of Ravenna, is a skilled and trusted politician, a great defender of his church, a great lord, a great defender of his church, lord. Honestly, he cares so much for those nephews. If one wants to get from him, it's enough to pay nephews. Part of those votes went to his son, so the angel and the story remain unclear. Hence, one of those nephews was actually his son, so the archbishop cared for him. Salimbeni also says that he had a daughter, the archbishop, who was a nun in, I don't remember which monastery. And I, says Salimbeni, was also her confessor at one point, and she did not know who her father was. Everyone else, however, naturally knew. So what? Naturally, this is a society where laughing at priests and bishops, womanizers, suitors, and fornicators is normal. Also because probably these same bishops and priests, like the priests, who hope to frame the effects of a small when they try to impose a certain standard of rigor on ordinary believers with a certain standard of rigor, and I explain to you, do not push too far, not thinking it strange. So write again. And here I would have liked to summarize another of these fables, one of these French poems from the 1200s or early 1300s, but it is here that I immediately found myself in difficulty because these French authors are not afraid of words. Therefore, given our hypocrisy, I am sure that citing the title in Old French will have less impact. Of the bishops, those who do well, and if the respect is to be a little more, of the bishop who blessed, it is necessary to shift the response and say that the response is to be a little more. There are swear words. In fablio, it's a bit more yet not, but this is my affection. In boccaccio, there are no swear words. Boccaccio, in the 14th century in pre-humanistic Italy, tells incredibly heavy stories, leaving nothing unaddressed, but he does not use profanity. Always use periphrases and circumlocutions, as in the novella of Donoggiani and Comare Gemata. Lifted the shirt, 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 lifted the shirt. He took the stake with which he planted the men and quickly placed it in the furrow made for that purpose. But there are none there. Or like in the case of Gianni Lotharingi's wife, who, excuse the repetition, was also waiting for her lover, but instead her husband came home early. Fortunately, the lover had not yet arrived, but how to inform him? The husband wants to go to bed, they are in bed, and it's time for the lover to arrive. The lover arrives outside and knocks softly on the door. The husband asks, "What's happening?" And the wife replies, "Well, I think it must be a ghost, you know." "It must be a ghost. It's a ghost. And sleep is the 30th. But I know a spell to drive away ghosts." And then the wife says, "And then if they don't make him hear, so the lover outside hears, they send him out and he starts to recite." Ghost. Ghost that goes out at night. You came to Coda Rita, and to Coda Rita you will go. But there are no bad words, as you can see. In the worst case, one can resort to that wonderful parish that truly exists somewhere in Tuscany, in the municipality of Borgo San Lorenzo. Noted by Boccaccio in the tale of Alatiel, renewal, the parish of San Cresci in Valcava, is progressing. I seek it beloved by local women. But unlike the French of the previous century, they do not have these scruples. The risk for the risk is that the risk is somewhat another thing. The matter is that there was this bishop who loved the company of ladies. And I did a translation of some research to see the substance of some of these movements. And then he relaxed and made the word of Berlin heard. He paid well and always had it available. Ready to do everything he wanted, because it was said in parentheses, and then it was learned that they only think about money, and she, they think, is money. And if one cannot pay a lot, one can forget about having luck with women. After that, the bishop has a pastor who lives with his pretender, and I have done. And you, come here to me, and we will surprise. However, it stands out too much, risked, that he considered saying no, and then he realized, and died. Pressure, the priest, to leave his woman. In every way, there is a whole burlesque series of prohibitions. He summons him, saying, "Enough with this story, Monsignor. I absolutely cannot. Look, if you continue to stay with that woman, I forbid you to drink wine for the rest of your life." He returns home, and his wife says, "Look, you can't drink it. Suck it through the straw." He returns home, and his wife says, "Look, here is the straw, and if I say what you do with it, it continues." In the end, however, the persecuted parish priest decides on a counter move and maintains good relations with a noblewoman from the area of whom it is known that she is the bishop's lover. This noblewoman, the parish priest, goes to visit her and says, "Madam, you must help me, please, because my bishop is truly persecuting me. Here I am, the noblewoman. If I say no, you create a plot against me. The next time the bishop comes to visit me, you come and I'll hide you behind the bed curtains." The bishop arrives, wine, dinner, spices, and then at that point he has read. The bishop undresses. He is already ready. And the lady tells him, "Bishop, I discovered you." And she began to ask him if my network felt initial. The lady, who seemed quite curious and a bit hesitant, began to ask him in a gentle manner if my network, which had been established recently, felt initial or not. "It's fine, madam. Everything you want. Yes, it can be done if you have the time. You only feel it in your head, and then you feel it." Omnia secula, E raises hand, cross, over, F recites, omnia secula, seculorum. And the priest who is hidden behind responds, just his head, and then only the head is heard. In the end, the Bishop Young says, listen, do what you want, just don't come back in front of me and take care of yourself. So here it is clear that there is a double standard. In this sense, it would be stranger in this text that the church has the duty to teach Christians the right behaviors and therefore establishes a series of rules and norms. After that, it is expected that the true text will struggle a lot. Yes, that is true. These norms are not imposed blindly, randomly, driven by a repressive impulse or something worse, some form of sadism or misogynistic delusion. No, the point is, here we must try to understand. The clergy in medieval society includes, I do not want to say almost all intelligent people, but they are the vast majority of intelligent people, almost all the people up to a certain time who have an education, who are used to reading, reflecting, reasoning, and have the task of teaching Christians how to live. In all fields, there is no obsession with sexual life, but sexual life is a natural part of existence, and therefore the clergy must also take care of this. And here, in the clergy, canonists are responsible for establishing rules and norms for confessors, and they strive to understand what needs to be taught to Christians. If one reads these works, they see the effort to be systematic, to anticipate the things that may happen, and also to say, this is serious, this is more serious, that other thing is, after all, not so bad. To illustrate, let me give you an example, and you will understand me better. Uguccione of Pisa, a canonist from the late 12th, late century. Among the issues that Uguccione of Pisa addresses at one point is the following. Is it permissible to have sex solely for the purpose of giving pleasure to the wife? As you know, at first glance, one would say no, it is procreation. It is the purpose of sex. It is the marital purpose. It is the purpose of having children. However, Uguccione of Pisa says yes, but St. Paul, in the first letter to the Corinthians, said that the husband fulfills his duty to his wife, and likewise, the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Similarly, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does as well. And at this point, Uguccione of Pisa says, if St. Paul goes so far as to say this, it is because there is a need, there is a right, and a right means that I need something and you must give it to me. And this is something that I absolutely need, is to have sex with satisfaction. The concept of marital duty means that the wife must be satisfied. After this, Uguccione of Pisa proceeds. The reasoning is connected, right? We have established this. What happens in practice, says Uguccione of Pisa. Listen to what a 12th century canonist knew. It often happens that the marital duty is rendered to the wife without satisfying one's own pleasure, and vice versa. Here I must say that I have thought with astonishment about the rules, the theories that were in place when I was a boy in the 70s. Do you remember when there was a trend for simultaneous orgasms? It seemed that the only way a couple could make love was if they both reached satisfaction at the same moment. With terrible feelings of guilt afterward because one still couldn't succeed, Uguccione says it is a fact that very often sex happens because one partner desires it and the other does it to satisfy that desire. Uguccione often states that in these cases, the woman precedes her husband, meaning she reaches orgasm first. And when the woman's pleasure in the carnal act is satisfied, then the gift of a carnal work is fulfilled. I can, like a better man, withdraw if I want, without satisfying my own pleasure, without judging my arrival. They ask me every headline. So I did not waste the seed. And remember any example you will have. Right. Without violating the discourse that one should not waste semen and then postponing the discussion of making love, it is important to act decisively and transform one's situation. And so naturally, by exploring this literature, one finds a detailed analysis of many things. What can be done and what cannot. well understood. When something cannot be done, it doesn't mean we should imagine that one ends up on the pyre. Here is the clergy giving rules to the faithful. And if a faithful person goes to confess having engaged in anal sex, for example, then the confessor knows to investigate how often they were forced or not forced, resulting in 5 to 40 days of penance or fasting. Because situations and positions change, and it also depends on the positions. There are authors, it's better not to detail much. Another author says we should detail as we end up teaching them. But there is also an author who says that one must go into detail given the monstrosities that are heard in confession these days. And so, for example, one of the greatest theologians of the 200s, Albertus Magnus, reflects at length on positions and says, of course, all positions are deviations, they are all sins, but some more than others, and then it needs to be considered, because there are cases where conceiving in the normal position is not easy, says Albertus Magnus. Imagine a couple of obese individuals. Then the two obese people are allowed, within certain limits, to experiment with other positions. The position is a bit more subtle. It's a minor sin, but it's more explicit because they are in Latin. The activity is an individual one. Lateral deviation is the lateral position, the sitting position and evening position. How are the feet? Then standing. The earth is heavier. Then the heavier is from behind like horses. Some argue that this is a grave sin. The outside is subtle, like the field, but I do not agree. I do not agree. Not all actions have the same gravity. Changes occur with tone limits. If another situation arises, a year of welcome may suffice. A minor sin can extend to 6 years of welcome. Homosexual relationships, though serious, vary in gravity. Among boys who may not fully grasp the situation, a year of penance suffices for youthful indiscretions. Among adults, it can extend to 10 years of penance. We are discussing penance. I haven't always been credible. If I confess to the priest, he must believe me. Efforts have been made and things have been done. There are books published on the history of gay and its repression. I am not yet involved in its repression, but it is a matter that needs to be understood to see if the laws prohibiting homosexual acts were enforced. It is not that I engaged in sodomy, as they said, whether it existed in the communal era or not. The feeling is that before the end of the 300s, 400s, it is rare to find cases of application. While from the 400s onwards, there are indeed efforts by the authorities to seek out these forms of deviance and suppress them. In Florence, for example, in the 1400s, trials for sodomy are very frequent. They usually conclude with fines. Once you enter this path, along this path, the canonists sometimes have fun. It is impossible not to think that they enjoyed themselves in certain cases. Like that canonist who, to exhaust all cases and answer questions, steps away from normality, must do nothing. From this, one sins more. The reality is that it should not have its frictions, so its class is beautiful. And the author's remarks to you, there are two schools of thought. Some say that it is a greater sin to fornicate with a beautiful girl, a little time spent with the act of being with my girlfriend, because with her, you enjoy being together for a long time, while with the old woman, you want to finish as quickly as possible. The author's existence is good, but another school of thought exists. Some say fornicating with an old woman is a greater sin, and others presented a market of substance. Remember, there are others. Mitigating factors, beauty. While in the other case, there are no mitigating factors. Now, fornicators and adulterers fall into the nets of ecclesiastical justice. It seems the frequency of these cases increases as we move towards the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Artists said the divine are close to us as we return to meet our fathers who know more than all of us. However, there were also many before them. Canonists also question this. The prohibitions are so clear. How is it that our courts must judge adulterers, judge fornicators, and administrator? There is a canon lawyer who responds, it's that people say I do what I want. This effort by theologians and jurists to create a case law and thus establish acceptable behaviors, some deviant but not too serious, and others increasingly serious, is naturally also connected to medicine. In the Middle Ages, there exists a medicine, and it is a sophisticated and complex medicine that derives directly from classical medicine, naturally from the Greek tradition, from Hippocrates and Galen. Today, we cannot help but say that regarding the medicines that were administered, the treatments that were given, it is unlikely that they did any good. But they were not administered randomly. They were based on a conception, on a theory, on a very complex theory of how the human body is made, the humors, the hot, the cold, the dry, the wet that combine in different forms, the excess of blood, the excess of bile. Nutrition that can aggravate the defects of a body or alleviate them, and so on. It was a complex science. There are canonists who, aware that doctors have something to say about the body and sex, look to what the doctors say in order to establish their rules and try to create guidelines that respect the scientific approach. Once again, Albertus Magnus raises the issue of female masturbation. How serious is female masturbation? Not very much, says Albertus Magnus, especially in girls. Because for girls, it is enough to talk to doctors, and it is clear what happens at the time of puberty. Around the age of 14, the young woman begins to desire intercourse. And yet until she is married, she cannot actually make love. Albertus Magnus states that she resorts to manual practices, using her fingers or other instruments, but struggles to achieve full satisfaction. He explains that doctors tell us the woman is cold. Her body is cold, while the man is warm. However, the woman is cold, and her pores are very closed, making it difficult for them to open, so she does not relax essentially. All things that indeed make us smile, but which are in line with a scientific theory, this is what I wanted to emphasize. And by trying repeatedly, the girl eventually manages to relax her ducts, and the fluids are released. It becomes evident that when they succeed, their anxieties are resolved, and they become more chaste. In other words, for a girl of that age, it is a physiological necessity, says Albertus Magnus. Oh, of course, the medicine I'm talking about is largely theoretical, based on a very sophisticated but abstract conception of how the human body works. But towards the end of the Middle Ages, progress begins to be made, right? Towards the end of the Middle Ages, cadaver dissections start. To understand, to see if Aristotle was right, if the others were right, in describing our internal organs as being made in a certain way. There is a widespread prejudice that the medieval church prohibited the dissection of corpses, but this is not the case at all. For a long time, the issue was not even raised. It did not occur to anyone. But when doctors began to want to do it, the clergy, certainly there is concern that the human body, a sacred thing, could be desecrated in this way. It must be clear that there is no intention to desecrate. Therefore, if the goal is knowledge, anyone in the Middle Ages would have agreed that knowledge is one of the ends of man. Even Dante knew this, as we were not made to live like brutes. And it is the most orthodox version one can imagine. God placed us here and endowed us with intelligence to challenge us to understand how the world is made, how the cosmos is made, and how we are made. Therefore, if it is for the sake of knowledge, it is obvious that doctors can do it. Today, we find ourselves in a societal context where our lives are rooted in a reality that feels primitive and backward. Then one says, it ends up on the table with students, but if my mom ends up there, she tells me she is no longer in this world. In the Middle Ages, society had some sensitivity towards this issue. However, I view it as an event. But the doctors proceed with scientific coldness. Once they knew there was no prohibition, it is not something that can be done. I quote a passage from a diary account of anatomy by Mondino de Liuzzi, one of the greats. It is an exercise that can be done. It is an exercise that deals with the uterus, regarding how large the uterus is and why sometimes it is larger or smaller. The woman I anatomized last year in 1314 in January had a uterus twice the size of the one I anatomized the same year in March, while the uterus of the sow I dissected in 1316 was 100 times larger than any I have ever seen in a female human. It is progress, as you see. It is progress. Doctors can dissect not only pigs, but also humans, compare them, and learn how our anatomy is structured. Then, well understood, in the same world where there were Mondino de Liuzzi, who dissected women in the classroom in Bologna, there were all sorts of beliefs among good people, all sorts of superstitions and spells. Folklore on this is quite heavy. One only needs to look at what was believed about menstrual blood. Menstrual blood collects data from treatises, removes data from rare treatises, stops grain germination, sours must, affects recidivists, kills grass on contact, kills bedding on contact, sparing struts, plants lose fruits, leads to death, rusts iron, and dogs consuming it get rabies. Here one might say, I could certainly say it to all the men who are in a risky situation. Ah, finally, even the superstitious Middle Ages look, and who see how one can act with respect to the dignified. Sorry to let you down. I like it. Medievals read in Pliny the Younger. Medievals said them first in Younger's works. So it was a scientific treatise from antiquity that had transmitted all these things to the learned of the Middle Ages. After that, precisely, and so precisely. Opposite scientific culture are concrete practices. Magic, like aborting, not served in a crowded world, or avoiding conception. In a world where there are many unmarried people who still have sex, who are not married, who are not subjected. In a world full of relationships of all kinds. In a world where cohabitation without being married is very normal, judicial sources continuously tell us who the woman is. The partner of the said person. In this world, not having children is a problem that arises. What can be done? There is a funny case, an interesting case that comes out from an inquisitorial process. Its concept of inquisition, not because they were prosecuted for this, but this is a concept of inquisition. In the early 14th century, a major trial in the Pyrenees involved many Cathars, retics, and heretics. An inquisitor attentively explains Italian instructions. Attentive and very intelligent, he questions countless mountain dwellers and asks them a lot of things that apparently have little to do with finding the Cathars, about the analyses because they interest him in reconstructing this world. Then probably in the end they will be useful to him, and in any case, they are very useful to us. From this record of inquisitorial interrogations conducted in the Pyrenees at the beginning of the 14th century, a great historian, Emanuele Roald de Ruy, derived a famous book, Montaillou, an Occitan village, the story of a village. In this village of Montaillou, the strong man is the parish priest, Pierre Clergue. He is a personality, let's say larger than life, new, and one who should be read with a lot of local context, who has videos, one who dominates in the village and comes from a wealthy family. His brother is the bailiff and therefore the main official of the area. This parish priest is a man who has charm, has the gift of gab, has money, and does whatever he wants in the village. Among other things, he goes to bed with the only noble woman in the village. In the village, there is a castle. You need to take a phone that creates a social cooling zone and will help you renew. And his wife, this instead, Friar Paul's video, should also be an idea for renewal. Obviously, she goes to bed with the parish priest. It is also said that if I went to bed with my partner, as we had agreed, we would try not to have children. And he had the remedy, thinking of me as a carefree dancer. When Pierre Clergue wanted to know me carnally, he brought an herb wrapped in a linen handkerchief. It was as big as the first phalanx of my pinky finger, and it had a long thread that passed around my neck while we made love. And this thing with the grass at the end of the thread descended between my breasts and down to my navel. Well, it seems like an awakening compared to those of de Liuzzi, as if we are in the parades, showing me how great the work is. Both of these approaches coexist. However, in all these cases, what you see is that sexuality is nonetheless a universal dimension of life, and there are not many taboos surrounding it. And it is precisely in this regard that I wanted to show a couple of images. Here, I don't see it. I was certainly expecting it. These are very trivial things, but here we are. This is the fresco of the Fountain of Abundance in Massa Marittima. I don't know how well you can see it. It's a fresco from the late 200s to early 300s. It was only discovered in 1999 because for about 6 centuries, the good inhabitants of Massa Marittima were not supposed to see these things, which had instead been commissioned by the municipality at the end of the 200s. The fountain is located in the middle of the town. Behind it is the large grain warehouse, where the municipality stores supplies to feed the people in case of famine. This is why abundance does not mean that there is actually enough. There are indeed different theses on this. But let's say it is the head of Vents, something that celebrates fertility, from which abundance derives. There is a tree with fruits and women behind it, not all of them. We haven't seen olive photography yet, as they use a stick to make fruits fall and then put them in their bags, without trusting these fruits, and then they see them inside, or write about them later. There are some complications. The blackbirds, it is not clear what they are. We are doing well at his house. Some have given political interpretations. There is this guide. The only thing that interests us is that you see what the fruits of the tree are. We see them in another way if we become acquainted with the figures of this.
Yes, if the mayor of Gubbio were to do it today.
This is where I wanted to reach.
What would happen? I had to write here. He would like to do it. It's an explosion. Yes, as soon as I remember you, because among other things, this kilo is in a place of mass that is not hidden. This kilo is the place of Nelson. It is a very central location.
It is certainly a central place. There are all sorts of cultural references. It is a complex matter. It is not a pornographic film shown in the square. It contains various types of content. However, what is certain is that today, no Italian municipality would have an image of a tree with phalluses hanging from it painted in the square, just as it is unlikely that, in a cycle of decorations for a church, one would see details like those painted by Giotto. In the chapel of the Scrovegni, in the large fresco that represents injustice, where injustice reigns, bad things happen. And all the things that happen down at the very center, and among the bad things that happen down there, we see it better. We clearly see an episode. Do you know? Here it is. This is it. Here the interpretations are mainly those making mistakes. Interpretations also diverge. There are brigands who have murdered a woman and are stripping her. Certainly, in the Scrovegni chapel, this is certain, it is the folder of the purposes. Giotto painted a woman who is probably being raped. Instead, you must find the story of the woman who was stripped and murdered by brigands. Because if you explain to people what injustice is, you have to say things. You have to say things, and you cannot keep them hidden. And I would conclude precisely with this fact of saying things and not keeping them hidden. Who said it was a fuck? I was telling you about swear words. The 200s family used the words perceive and oveste with maximum freedom. 200's French fabliaux use the words with C and F with maximum freedom. Taste is changing. Standards are changing. But in France in the 200s, it's not that bad words don't exist. It's that the person who doesn't exist, that no one knows, thinks those are ugly words. Of course, those are ugly words. The problem is that everyone uses them. So what should we do? It is truly the next thing in that era. In the French literature of that time, there is a whole series of texts that address this theme. The first thing that clearly emerges is this loss of this moment of this year, and that despite all the words, it has been possible to work. Sundays are always ours. Good women, yes, they should not use them. And then there is, for example, the fable of the squirrel, and they must not use them, where a wealthy woman lectures her 14-year-old daughter saying, he is a man who cannot be explained, be careful. At 14, they marry because a woman is ready at her first menstruation. You are a woman now, no longer a wild girl. He is a man that cannot be explained. Certain rules must be respected. He is a man that cannot be explained. As you know, wearing the veil, once a woman is married in the Middle Ages, she is no longer seen by strangers without a veil, not on her face, but on her hair, clearly. And the mother, who comes from a good family, because perhaps it was not the same among the maids, seems to understand, explains to her daughter that she must be very careful not to use certain words. What words, Mom? You must never mention that thing that men have. What do men have, Mom? Oh, yes, that thing they have hanging there in front. Ah, that thing that Dad has hanging between his legs. And what is it called, Mom? You shouldn't say it. But it must have a name. It's a fish. No, son, it's not a fish. It's a cane. No, son, it's not a cane. In the end, Mom lets the word come out. In Old French, vite. It's the truth. And the daughter says, that's all. But I hear it said continuously. My brother says it all the time. The servant says it constantly. I want to say it too. And I give myself permission. After that, this theme, why swear words are swear words, why women don't use them, is right, makes sense, is nonsense. This theme is posed by the most popular book of the entire French Middle Ages, The Romance of the Rose. The Romance of the Rose. I am talking about a flowing novel. It was popular, the biggest bestseller of the era, translated into all tongues, a source of pride. In Italy, it was translated into a series of sonnets, the biggest bestseller of the era, Il Fiore, translated into tongues, which according to Gianfranco Contini could even be attributed to Dante. In Italy, it has been translated into media, The Romance of the Rose, therefore the most famous and popular book of its time. In a family exercise, in The Flower, at a certain point, raises the issue of swear words. Why? There is a dialogue between the protagonist, who, it should be noted, is a lover who desires nothing more than to finally grasp the rose. The novel is called The Novel of the Rose, and in the end, it describes at length in thousands of verses how the rose is finally picked, which makes us. But before we get there, it is a great effort. It is a single thing that responds to us, scientific discussions of every kind, and tell me every truth with various characters. Among which reason for reason. The reason is obviously the woman, and the values for which he set the line of guilt had to be re-exercised. Reason, as it has been written by the directors of God, just like nature, is one of the greatest gifts of God, which their places are making for nature. The world has been made by nature in obedience to the rules of reason, and we have reason to decipher it. At this point, the character of reason, discussing with the protagonist, I want to say a show, is that you thought it would not at some point use the word with a C. In the plural, quais. The lover, I mean the male protagonist, is scandalized. You mentioned the C's, which do not sound good at all coming from a well-mannered girl. If you really have to talk about these things, there is another thing that makes me happy, the protagonist continues. It is the thought of marriage. Do as the nurses do, who when they handle and wash newborns, which is true and not true, use many dominions to identify a thing. It's another thing that makes me happy. Yes, these words shouldn't be used according to you. It's the thought of marriage. Yes, the little one is a man who is not a desire, and he uses me, and he goes out with your charge. I do it, but look, I think we all agree that everything has its own name, and that name must be used when talking about that thing. And the lover says, yes, but after all, these things are ugly. And he is right. He says, excuse me, and according to you who created the sea, God created them, and he created them with a specific purpose, and they serve to do something very important. And this is the video I made. I call them by their name. I connect with their name. I have reminded myself to comment and to read. Let's say that indeed the fearsome ogre of the noble of Courtship has truly been my notorious maker for men. At this point, the male protagonist tries to regain ground and says, yes, no, well, of course, those things in themselves are noble, undoubtedly. They were created by God, they are noble. It is the word that is ignoble. The word is shameful, and in short, at this point, reason tells him, according to you, the word is the thing itself noble, but the word is shameful. Do you know where the word comes from? There's nothing with what there is. And we decided to call them that. Based on this, you tell me the word is wonderful. And the word was invented at some point. It has nothing to do with that object. We decided to call them that. And so, only on this basis do you say that the word is shameful. In itself, the word I see is not shameful at all. Imagine, reason says, that they had made an opposite choice. That they had decided to call C, ellipses, the relics, that they had decided to call C, ellipses, the relics. And that to indicate our C, they had chosen the word relics. Precisely. Then, says reason, You who now reproach me would have considered the word reliquy ugly and vulgar, while you would find the word CI to be wonderful, and you would be ready to kiss them in their golden and silver chests. And reason goes even further and says it's absurd. That these words are considered scandalous is doubly absurd, and it is only women who make such a fuss about it. Women should also stop this silly habit of referring to these things as bags, tools, things, pine cones, and so on. Please call them by their name. This, I would say, is in the absolutely most famous and popular book of the Middle Ages. It is the most convenient result. It is better, there you go. I told you that I would hardly manage to exhaust the topic or present it in an orderly manner. Hardly. It would be chosen that the document has been ordered, but it seemed to me that it would not have been registered. The main purpose is to show you as always. The main purpose is to show you as always. And all the things that we do here, the Middle Ages, which is a more complex issue compared to the experiments that we sometimes have. Thank you.